G'day everyone. I've got here today a quiz about some really interesting and little known facts about Australia. So if you think you know everything there is to know about Australia, then play along. I think most Australians will not get the answers to this quiz. I say that because I'm Australian, I went to school here and they didn't tell us these things at school. So as I say, I'm going to ask a question, I'll count to 3 and then I'll give you the answer. Let me know in the comments below how you go, and if you like the quiz, then pass it on to someone else. So question number 1. How many states are there in Australia? 3, 2, 1. Well, most people would say either 7 or 8, I would think, but in fact, there are actually 16. I won't actually say what they are just at the moment, because if I did, it might give you some of the clues to some of the questions I'm going to ask next. How many territories are there on the mainland of Australia? 3, 2, 1. Well, I think most Australians could name 2, but they'd be blissfully unaware that there's a third one called the Jervis Bay Territory. It's east of the ACT and similarly used to be part of New South Wales and was carved out in the 1920s to primarily give the federal government the capacity to make a port of their own, which they haven't done. The Jervis Bay Territory, I was there earlier this year, well actually in the middle of this year, and it's predominantly national park. It's quite a beautiful place, but pretty much, well, not very densely populated. Very interesting concept anyhow, this third mainland territory that very few Australians know about. Question number 3. I hope you're still playing along. Have there ever been any other mainland territories? 3, 2, 1. Yes, there have. The Northern Territory was carved into 2 between 1927 and 1931 into the 2 territories of North Australia and Central Australia. The capital of the North Australia was Darwin, and the capital of Central Australia was Alice Springs, which is probably why Alice Springs is such a significant city in the context of the Northern Territory. And at some point in the times of the Northern Territory was, as significant. What is Australia's largest territory? 3, 2, 1. Well, I think most Australians would say the Northern Territory, but in actual fact, the Antarctic Territory is larger. In fact, it is very large. Almost 6 million square kilometres compared to the mainland of Australia, which is 7.6 million square kilometres. Now, this was declared part of the British Empire in the mid-19th century and was subsequently passed on to Australia to administer, like many other of Australia's territories. But due to some international treaties that have occurred in the 20th century, there's only a small number of nations which recognise Australia's claim over the Australian Antarctic Territory. And many nations, predominantly Russia, have a large number of bases within the Australian Antarctic Territory. Well, here's the list of Australia's states and territories as of 2022. On the left here, you've got the 6 states of Australia and the 2 mainland territories that most Australians would be familiar with. And on the right, you've got some things that you may or may not have heard of before, but certainly today we've talked about the Jervis Bay Territory, the Antarctic Territory, but I think some Australians may be familiar with Norfolk Island. Certainly Christmas Island is in the news a lot because of the detention centres that are there, but perhaps you may not have been aware of the fact that that's a separate territory. But there are also a number of other territories there which I may or may not talk about later on in this quiz. Next question. How many independent nations in 2022 were once territories of Australia? 3, 2, 1. Well, the answer is 2. I wonder if you could name them. One of them, I think if you actually mention this to the people of that nation, get very annoyed. That nation being New Zealand, because New Zealand was actually part of Australia for a very short time between 1840 and 1841. And if you ever, one of the best ways to rile up a New Zealander as an Australian is to say, New Zealand's just like Australia. It's almost like a state of Australia. And at one point it was administered by the colony of New South Wales, and then subsequently become independent. Of course, we need to recognise, of course, that New Zealand and Australia were, of course, lands that were occupied and invaded by the Europeans. I'm not trying to downplay that. Similarly with Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea was part of Australia between 1906 and 1975. That's another example that was once part of the British Empire and was handed over to Australia to administer. And that was actually given full independence in 1975. So that's an example of a significant part of Australia that was handed back to the Indigenous people for self-governing government. So, speaking about colonisation, discovery of Australia and so forth, when did Europeans first discover Australia? Here's a few dates. 3, 2, 1. Well, the answer would be, in my opinion, 1609, because that's when the Keeling Islands were discovered by Captain Keeling. And that's an example of a territory of Australia. But other possibilities include 1616, Western Australia was actually mapped by Dirk Hartog. 1642, Tasmania by Abel Tasman. And of course, Captain Cook in 1770. But of course, the Portuguese passed by Australia in the 15th century and may very well have discovered Australia or noticed it as they passed it. But these dates are dates that are confirmed and can be justified by documentation such as maps. When did Australia become a sovereign, independent federal nation? 3, 2, 1. Well, if you've been paying attention in school, you probably would think that the answer to this question is 1901, because that's when the Commonwealth of Australia was created, when all the states of Australia joined together to form the Commonwealth of Australia. But in actual fact, the answer is 1986, because that's when it became a sovereign independent nation by the passing of the Australia Act in Australia and an identical act in the United Kingdom. Up until that time, we were part of England, the British Empire, and there were lots of unusual sorts of consequences of that. British people could come and vote here and get social security, and similarly in return, the highest court in Australia was the Privy Council in England. And 1986 was a crucial point in the independence of Australia. Of course, there are still some ties. The King of England is also the King of Australia as well. How many states or territories are there in which the majority of citizens are from a non-English background? 3, 2, 1. Well, the answer is 2. That's the Cocos, Keeling Islands and Christmas Island. And I'll describe that in a little more detail, but I'm going to ask another question, which is, how many states or territories are there in which the majority religion is either Islam or Buddhism? 3, 2, 1. Well, I think it's a bit of a giveaway that it would be very much related to the previous question. The Cocos Island comprises mainly of Cocos Malays who practice Sunni Islam. The population is quite small there, it's around about 600, and Islamic holy days are holidays in that territory. Christmas Island, the statistics there show that there's a significant people of Chinese descent, and these statistics of course come from the census, so they relate to how people identify themselves. So there's this very vague term there, Australian, which there are certainly a lot of people of English descent like myself, who have never really considered ourselves to be English, but have always considered ourselves to be Australian. But of course, if they're all citizens, they're all Australians. But anyhow, this is how they self-identify: of Chinese descent, of Malay descent, and so on and so forth. And the majority of people there either don't disclose their religion or have no religion. So the majority religion there is actually Buddhism. Are there any states or territories, former or current, in which the majority of people speak a unique dialect of English? 3, 2, 1. And the answer to this is yes. The first one is a former territory, which is Papua New Guinea, where they speak Pissin, which is a sort of a way of saying pigeon. And if you haven't heard Pissin or New Guinea Pidgin English, you must do it. It is absolutely unintelligible to, I think, a native English speaker. But I do recall being taught some basic phrases in primary school, strangely enough. The other major territory is Norfolk Island, where the majority of people speak this Norfolk Island language, which is an amalgam of 18th century English and Polynesian. And the reason why it's an amalgam of those two languages is the majority of the population are descendants of the mutineers of the Bounty, in which the male mutineers left the ship, met up with Polynesian women and formed their own society, originally on Pitcairn Island, which is at the extreme end of the Polynesian world, very, very long way in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And of course, they do speak standard English as well, but they're trying to keep that language alive. And there are other parts of Australia where they do speak other dialects of English, but not the majority of a territory or a state. There are parts of the Northern Australia where they Aboriginal communities speak unique dialects of English, such as Robe River English, which I would say is intelligible to native English speakers if you sort of bend your ear a little bit and know what you're listening for. So, in what year did the residents of Norfolk Island first have to pay income tax? 3, 2, 1. Well, 2016. And that was really in response to a collapsed economy and exchange for the right to draw Social Security. These other dates relate to the dates in which income tax was first collected, I think, in New South Wales, and the second one is relating to when it was first collected by the Commonwealth government at the same time, and 1942 was when they basically took over all income tax collection and the states were no longer able to do that. Question 12. Did Germany ever invade Australia during World War I? 3, 2, 1. Yes, they did. And that was in the Cocos-Keeling Islands in 1914. And the island was subsequently retaken by Australia the same day. So there was basically one German ship. They invaded the island. There was subsequently an Australian ship who was in the area. There was the Battle of the Cocos Islands, and Australia retook the island in the afternoon. Did Japan ever invade Australia during World War II? 3, 2, 1. Yes. And of course, I mentioned Papua New Guinea was part of Australia during World War II, and I think most Australians are aware of the Kokoda Trail campaign that occurred, and it's a very important part of Australian history and culture. But the Japanese, around the same time, also invaded Christmas Island. Has any state or territory ever voted to secede from Australia? And by secede, that means to break away from Australia and form their own nation. 3, 2, 1. Yes. In 1933, Western Australia held a referendum. The result of the referendum was in favour of secession. The Parliament petitioned the British Parliament, but the British Parliament determined that it had no authority to grant secession. Yes. That is something I learnt as a child because I lived in Western Australia, and I think even in the 1970s, people were still talking about seceding from the rest of Australia. And there is, I don't know whether it's still the case, but there was always this phrase, the eastern states. So there's Western Australia and the eastern states are sort of other. And I think the rationale, I'm not sure what the rationale was in 1933, but certainly in the 1970s, there was a feeling as if it was related to taxation and benefits. But WA was quite isolated from the rest of Australia physically in a way that it's not today. How many top-level internet domains are there in Australia? And by top-level internet domains, I mean like the .au domain, which I think most of you are familiar with, like courts.vic.gov.au. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Well, there are actually two, because in addition to the .au domain, there's also the .cc domain, which relates to the Cocos Islands. I'm not sure how many websites there are with a .cc top-level domain, given there's only about 600 people in the territory, but there you go, it exists. So how did you do? Let me know in the comments below, and let me know if you like this quiz, because I can put together some other quiz of fun facts if you like. I have some ideas in mind. All right, uru everyone.